Hi, you will be undergoing a study that will last for about 25 to 30 minutes. The title of this study is called Equality for Animals, which aims to explore the equality between humans and animals, focusing on the moral and ethical issues that concern the prevailing opinions against animals. Do you agree to give your consent?
As we were able to see, even if we try, we will not be able to get the consent of animals like our pets. Although what we showed you was a clip of reenactments, lighthearted and literally a dog show, situations of taking and harming animals are very evident and real, especially talking about animal testing and profits made off of animals. Just because we do not get their consent, or these non human animals cannot speak their minds like we can, does this mean that we are free to do what we want only for our gain and not for theirs? Peter Singer comes into this conversation, brings us his arguments, and asks along with us: equality for animals?
The principle of equal consideration of interests. According to Peter Singer, this fundamental principle of equality states that one should both include all affected interests when calculating the rightness of an action and weigh those interests equally. This can allow us to embrace all human beings with all the differences that exist between them. Then, this basis cannot only be limited to humans, but we're also committed to accepting it as a sound moral basis for relations with those outside their own species, the non human animals. If you remember Jeremy Bentham from Utilitarianism, Bentham pointed to the capacity for suffering as a vital characteristic that entitles a being to equal consideration. If, in a situation where a being suffers, there is no moral justification for not taking that suffering into consideration. So, who are speciesists? We might recognize the people labeled as racist as those who violate the principle of equality by giving greater weight to the interests of the members of their own race compared to those of another race. Similarly, Singer defined speciesists as people who give greater weight to the interests of members of their own species when there is a clash between their interests and the interests of those of another species. For example, human speciesists do not feel that pain is as bad when it is felt by pigs or mice as when it is felt by humans. Let's say that in applying the equal consideration of interests, if we consider it wrong to inflict that much pain on a baby for no good reason, then we must, unless we are speciesists, consider it equally wrong to inflict the same amount of pain on a horse for no good reason. Compared to humans, some reasoning behind using animals for experiments lie in our belief that animals are less aware of the anticipatory dread of being experimented on, therefore, would suffer less. If this is true, then this same argument gives us a reason for preferring to use human infants, orphans perhaps, or severely intellectually disabled humans for experiments, since they would also have no idea of what was going to happen to them compared to adults. Speciesism in practice. The use for animals for food is probably the oldest, most widespread, and basic form of animal use, and the foundation rests in the belief that animals exist for our pleasure and convenience. Animal flesh is a luxury rather than a necessity. Medical evidence indicates that animal flesh is not necessary for good health, nor is animal production an efficient way of producing food. Animal flesh is considered a luxury consumed because people like its taste. The strongest case against using animals for food is when they are made to lead miserable lives so that their flesh can be made available to humans at the lowest possible cost. As they say, cruelty is acknowledged only when profitability ceases. Our society tolerates methods of meat production that confine animals in cramped, unsuitable conditions for the entire duration of their lives. One problem is, of course, that using them as food involves killing them. Acts like castration, the separation of mother and young, the breaking up of herds, branding, transporting, and moments of slaughter, all of these are likely to involve suffering and do not take the animal's interest into account. So essentially, the principle of equal consideration of interests implies that it is wrong to sacrifice important interests of the animal in order to satisfy less important interests of our own. Experimenting on animals. Interestingly enough, the fact that people claim that experiment on animals lead to discoveries about humans already reveal that they agree that human and non-human animals are similar in crucial respects. There are a few well-known animal testing methods like drug companies performing the Drees test on rabbits, or the LD50, where a test is designed to find the lethal dose that will make 50% of a sample of animals die. But if we think about it, these tests are not necessary to prevent human suffering. Also, there are a lot of existing products of the same function, so there really is no need to develop new ones that might be dangerous. Parallel to this, not all university experiments can be defended that they relieve more suffering than they inflict. For example, you might be familiar with Harry Harlow's work with infant rhesus monkeys, which is considered a classic in behavioral science. Using isolation and maternal deprivation, and even moving to his famous surrogate mother experiment, these studies using animals lasted for more than 15 years, and although because of this, some new information was uncovered for humans, it also resulted in the depression, permanent developmental damage, and death of rhesus monkeys. There are many other areas that raise similar issues, including the fur trade, hunting in all its different forms, circuses, rodeos, zoos, and the pet business. The benefits of these studies to humans might be either non existent or uncertain, but the losses to the members of other species are certain and real. In relation to what was mentioned earlier, arguments about this have been made. For one side, they ask, would those against be prepared to let thousands die from a terrible disease that could have been cured by experimenting on one animal? But in the words of utilitarianists and in accordance with equal consideration of interests, it is always wrong to sacrifice one being, whether human or animal, for the benefit of another. The opponents of speciesism pose a rebuttal question of their own. Would experimenters be prepared to perform experiments on orphaned humans with severe and irreversible brain damage if that were the only way to save thousands? Experimenters, then, show bias or speciesism in favor of their own species whenever they carry out experiments on non human animals for purposes that they would not think justified them in using human beings at an equal or lower level of sentience, awareness, sensitivity, and so on. If this bias were eliminated, the number of experiments performed on animals would greatly reduce.
Now let's go to some objections that Peter Singer addressed. The first question is, how do we know that animals can feel pain? To answer this, let's take a look at some similarities between living things, specifically humans and animals. It is true that we can never directly experience the pain of another being, whether that being is human or not. But when we see someone in pain, we know that they are in pain because of the way they behave. For example, you see your friend fall on the stairs. You don't know how exactly they feel, but you know that they got hurt because of their reaction and behavior. Singer said that the belief that animals can feel pain is similar to this example. Animals behave mostly the same way as humans do when they feel pain, and according to Singer, this justifies the belief that they indeed do feel pain. Given this, we ask another question, which is this possible even without the use of language? The simple answer is yes. Just like how young babies show they are in pain without talking, the same goes for animals showing pain without the use of language. Another explanation for how we know animals can feel pain is that the nervous system of all vertebrates are fundamentally similar to each other. This makes it likely that the capacity of animals to feel pain is similar to us humans. The next question or objection that Singer aimed to answer is animals eat each other, so why shouldn't we eat them? This is also called the Benjamin Franklin objection because before, Franklin used to be a vegetarian, but when he was watching some of his friends prepare to fry a fish, they saw that inside the fish they caught was another smaller fish inside its stomach. With this, he said, if you eat one another, I don't see why we may not eat you. To counter this argument, Singer gives some points to consider. First, Singer said that most animals who kill for food would not be able to survive if they did not kill. It is basically a means of survival for them. But for us humans, we can survive without having to eat animal flesh. Second, Singer also argued that it is odd that humans, who normally think of the behavior of animals as beastly, should, when it suits them, use an argument that implies that we should look to animals for moral guidance. Last, Singer mentioned that non human animals are not capable of considering the alternatives open to them or of reflecting on the ethics of their diet. This is why it is impossible to hold the animals accountable or to argue that they deserve to be treated the same way because of their killing. In short, humans cannot avoid responsibility just by simply imitating beings who are not even capable of making ethical or moral choices. Now we look at this objection from a different perspective. Sometimes people point out that animals eat each other in order to make a slightly different point. What this suggests is that people think it's not that animals deserve to be eaten, but rather that there is a natural law according to which the stronger prey upon the weaker, a kind of survival of the fittest, in which by eating animals we are simply doing our part. But Singer argues that this interpretation makes two basic mistakes. First, it is a mistake of fact. It lies in the assumption that our own consumption of animals is part of the natural evolutionary process. This might be true for a few primitive cultures, but it has nothing to do with the mass production of domestic animals in factory animals. The second mistake is an error of reasoning. If we did not hunt for food and it was part of a natural process, there would then be an error in the assumption that just because this process is natural, it is already right. Yes, it is important that we know the natural laws that affect us, but we don't need to assume that the natural way of doing things is incapable of improvement. Next, we take a closer look at the differences between humans and animals. Throughout history, there have been attempts to differentiate between humans and animals, but these differences or boundaries are short lived. Examples of these attempts are as follows. In earlier times, it used to be said that only humans use tools, but then it was later on observed that the Galapagos woodpecker used the cactus thorn to dig insects out of crevices in trees. Next, it was suggested that even if other animals use tools, humans are the only ones who can make tools. But later on, Jane Goodall found that chimpanzees in the Tanzanian jungles chewed up leaves to make a sponge for sopping up water and trimmed the leaf off branches to make tools for catching insects. Another attempt to differentiate humans from animals is the use of language. But now, chimpanzees, gorillas, and an orangutan have learned Amazigh, the sign language of the deaf, and there is some evidence that whales and dolphins have their own complex language. But, according to Singer, even if these attempts to draw the line fitted the facts of the situation, they would still not carry any moral weight, meaning the fact that a being does not use language or make tools is hardly a reason for ignoring its suffering. Now let's talk about some objections and differences that are concerned with self consciousness and autonomy. Some philosophers have claimed that animals cannot think or reason and that accordingly they have no conception of themselves, no self consciousness. They do not have autonomy or the ability to choose how to live one's life. And the thing is, it has been suggested that autonomous, self conscious beings are in some way much more valuable and more morally significant. The first suggestion is severely intellectually disabled humans who do not possess the capacities that mark the normal human off from other animals should nevertheless be treated as if they possess these capacities since they belong to a species, members of which normally possess these capacities. This suggests that we should treat individuals not in accordance with their actual qualities, but in accordance with the qualities normal for their species. But what is Singer's take on this suggestion? He said that we cannot insist that beings be treated as individuals in one case and as members of a group in the other. Membership of a species is no more relevant in these circumstances than membership of a race or sex. The second suggestion is although severely intellectually disabled humans may not possess higher capacities than other animals, they are nonetheless human beings, and as such, we have special relations with them that we don't have with other animals. But what is Singer's take on this suggestion? According to him, the argument ties morality too closely to our affections. Ethics does not demand that we eliminate personal relationships and partial affections, but it does demand that when we act, we assess the moral claims of those affected by our actions with some degree of independence from our feelings for them. The third and last suggestion he addressed is once we take one step in a certain direction, we shall find ourselves on a slippery slope and shall slither further than we wish to go. This means that once we allow that an intellectually disabled human being has no higher moral status than an animal, the argument goes we have begun our descent down a slope, the next level of which is already denying rights to social misfits, and the bottom of which is a totalitarian government disposing of any groups it does not like by classifying them as subhuman. What is Singer's take on this last suggestion? The slippery slope argument may serve as a valuable warning in some contexts, but it cannot bear too much weight. We should not be deterred from trying to rectify this situation by the mere possibility that the principles on which we base this attempt will be misused by evil rules for their own ends. As a verdict from all these suggestions and objections, Singer concludes that no ethical line that is arbitrarily drawn can be secure. It is better to find a line that can be defended openly and honestly. It is important to note that Singer's arguments aim to elevate the status of animals rather than lower the status of humans. According to him, it is excessively pessimistic to refrain from trying to alter our attitudes on the ground that we might start treating intellectually disabled humans with the same lack of concern we now have for animals, rather than give animals the greater concern that we now have for intellectually disabled humans.
Ethics and reciprocity. In this last part, we take a closer look if ethics is equal to reciprocity. So Singer tried to distinguish between explanations of the origin of ethical judgments and justifications of these judgments. The explanation of origin of ethics in terms of an implied contract between people for their mutual benefit has a certain plausibility. We could accept this as a historical explanation without committing ourselves to any views about the rightness or wrongness of the ethical system that has resulted. No matter how self-interested origin of ethics may be, it is possible that once we started thinking ethically, we are led beyond mundane premises. Just like how Singer put it, for if the basis of ethics is that I refrain from doing nasty things to others as long as they don't do nasty things to me, I have no reason against doing nasty things to those who are incapable of appreciating my restraint and controlling their conduct towards me accordingly. To answer the question, is ethics equal to reciprocity? No. According to the contract view of ethics, this universalizing process should stop at the boundaries of our community. But once the process has begun, we may come to see that it would not be consistent with our other convictions to halt at that point because clearly such accounts exclude from the ethical sphere a lot more than non human animals. Singer ends with addressing these questions. If contract theories abandon reciprocity in this manner, however, what is left of the contract account? Why adopt it at all? And why limit morality to those who have the capacity to enter into agreements with us, if in fact there is no possibility of them doing so? This is simply asking what is the point of ethics and reciprocity if it won't even be carefully observed and followed? We know that pain and suffering are bad and should be prevented or minimized, irrespective of race, sex, or species of the being that suffers. How bad a pain is depends on how intense it is and how long it lasts. But pain of the same intensity and duration are equally bad whether felt by humans or animals. When we come to consider the value of life, we cannot quite so confidently say that a life is a life and equally valuable, whether it is a human life or an animal life. Although these thoughts may leave us with more questions than when we started, we know that the value of life is a notoriously difficult ethical question, yet perhaps we have shown a light to the losses of other species in the hands of humans.